And now moving on to the elephant in the room, literally, right? That's what Subhra and I spoke of. So diversity, equity, and inclusion. Are these just hyped words, or are they really meaning something for us? Do they really make a difference? And do they even exist in the research ecosystem? So our next panel, to be moderated by Subhra Priyadarshini, is Nurturing a Diverse and Equitable Research Ecosystem. I'd quickly like to call upon our panelists on stage. Lipi Thukral, Scientist, Associate Professor at CSIR-IGIB and Wellcome Trust India Alliance Intermediate Fellow. Bittu Kaveri Rajaraman, Associate Professor of Biology and Psychology at Ashoka University. Benno Boer, Chief of Natural Sciences, UNESCO. Mallika Tewari, Professor and Head of Department of Surgical Oncology, Institute of Medical Sciences at the Banaras Hindu University. A warm welcome to all of you. And we so hope and are sure of it, rather not hopeful, but sure of it, that all this wait for you as panelists and for all the audience is going to be worth it. Over to you, Subhra.
Thanks, Nidhi. Yes, so when we were talking about this panel earlier on, Nidhi asked me what to say as an introduction, and I said, elephant in the room, of course. But before this panel, we have had another elephant in the room addressed, which is affordability of open access, and we also had a bit of talk about gender segregated data. Right, so I think that's a great segue for all of us to begin this discussion, and I also think that we have a really cool panel, and it's across genders, across ages and hierarchies, and across disciplines. So I think let's begin by an introduction, and we think that we should do it a little differently. We should let the panelists introduce themselves, which is what would be a better thing in inclusivity to do. And I think we should also let everybody, disclose their pronouns, if that is okay with everyone. Lipi, with you.
Yeah, I am she and her. I am a computational biologist at Institute of Genomics and Integrative Biology. It sounds very far-fetched, but in reality we do simulations of proteins and membranes that allow us to understand the mechanisms of how cell operates at different processes. The main process that we are interested in autophagy, and yeah, I'm very glad to be here, and thank you, Subhra, for inviting me.
And just to add to that, she's a mommy to twins.
All right, my name is Bittu. I'm a genderqueer trans man. I will explain what that is later if you'd like. I don't know whether you wanted me to get into that now, but there are very few of us trans persons in academia, and so hopefully I'll talk a little bit about that, but also as an Ambedkarite from a caste privileged background, I'd like to also talk about caste and class, along with region and religion and how these intersectionally impact the way in which we can do science, along with our trans and other gendered identities. I am an associate professor of biology and psychology. So essentially I'm a neuroscientist. I work on behavior, ecology, the evolution of neural systems. And we work on insect communication, on how math and quantitative and numerical tasks are done by zebrafish and by dogs.
Thank you. My name is Benno Boer. I'm the program specialist for the Natural Science Unit at the UNESCO office in New Delhi. I'm a German citizen. My family is half Ethiopian, half German. My wife is also here with me. We have 3 children together. They are in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And my professional background is geography, geology, and ecology. sustainable human living.
Very good afternoon to everyone. My name is Dr. Mallika Tewari, and I am a cancer specialist. Either I should say, if I say it technically, I am a hepatopancreatico-biliary and gastrointestinal surgeon, cancer surgeon, surgical oncologist. There are various names to it. Thank you for that. So my association with Springer dates back to many years now, and ever since I was in the Association of Surgeons of India, which is a very big organization of about 30,000, over 30,000 members now, of which only less than 3,000 in fact are women. So we run a publication, it's a journal which is actually published by Springer. It's called the Indian Journal of Surgery. So I was in its editorial board since last 12 years now. So that's how I came in touch with ET, who manages it so well, and thank you, Subhra, for inviting me here. And currently I'm a professor in the Department of Surgical Oncology and Chief of the Hepatobiliary Unit at Banaras in the university. Thank you.
Yeah, so a surgeon and a woman, a rare breed. So that's what I'm saying. These all people on the panel basically have very niche things to share with us. And I'm so happy to have you all here. India just elected its second woman president, and that to a tribal woman, but that's great as something at the top. How difficult it is for women in mid-career positions or positions that do not get that kind of visibility, and not just women, we are also going to talk about other layers which India is just warming up to. So issues of transgenders, issues of caste, which is something unique in India, and how the academia and research community is basically poised today, and where should we aim for it to go. If we count the number of women directors of IITs or ISIRs, or any social science institute, if you will, your fingertips are enough. So that's the kind of numbers we're talking about. I don't want to go too deep into data, there's tons out there, but what we'll do quickly is to start with some lived experiences of these excellent panelists and hear from them what exactly have they faced as people, as whatever they have been in their shoes through their journey in research and academia. So any random order, anybody who wants to go first is good. And of course you can intervene at any point of time. We are not keeping the question answer session to in the end so that everybody can participate and we are not running out of time. So who wants to go first? Go ahead.
Probably have the mic, so maybe. Thank you again. I'm going to summarize some of the key points, as Subhra was saying, about being women in science. And these may correspond to some of the roots or origin, and I don't want to be redundant because Bittu and I have been on these panels, number of panels, so let's just start to talk about, in my opinion, the three key issues which relate to the problems that are faced. And the numbers that you're talking about are actually the ripple effect, that why don't we see the woman in leadership roles. So I hope these 3 points which I have tried to structure would explain what we go through. So 2 of them, in fact, are unconscious bias, and 1 of them, I think, is a conscious bias. So the 2 unconscious biases, which I feel are deep ingrained in the society, 1 of them is the support system. Absence or little is the word, and 1 in these support system is the professional setup, and the other is the personal setup. You are lucky if you have personal support system, and I would assume that the women who make it have a decent support system. And then I want to elaborate on the professional systems. So, for example, when you join as a young PI or an assistant professor, how many would rally behind you? How many would accompany you to different societies or number of conferences or give you list of things which are important? In other words, mentorship. The mentorship that is received by the women PIs is almost non-existent. And this is also a number game because you have less number of women PIs, so it's already overwhelming for us to mentor the incoming women PIs, but I'm saying that overall mentorship is the first thing which is very less, and this is the one thing you get for granted if you are a cis male. Now coming to the second unconscious bias which is there in the system is of course the topic of motherhood and the pace which lessens. Why do we have that in science more pronounced? Let me give you an example. We read literature, we've talked about publications, and that's the output. Once you go through 6 months of maternity leave, which is a very nice thing for, so hooray for Indian system to having it. I know my colleagues in US who do not get that. So we do have in postdoc and PI plus status the motherhood, the maternity leave of 6 months. Below that is a contentious topic, so I'll not touch that for students and for the consultants. But once you are in a, let's say, a more privileged position of a faculty, you do get 6 months. But what about the publications? What about the literature? Are you reading it? Will you be up to it? Most probably not. And then follows the other 6 months of very low confidence stage in your life because you've already missed a lot. So if you think COVID, you missed a lot, all the women go through COVID-like pandemic situation in their life when they birth a baby. And that is because you're missing on conferences, you cannot travel because your body and your surroundings do not allow you to do that. Plus, if you know you're confident, you have not gone through birthing a baby because those processes, those physical processes do not allow you to be confident. You've missed a lot, is what is the feel you get. Plus, the system has moved on. Now, there are 2 ways to look at this. And this unconscious bias is where an employer will say, oh, the whole thing has moved on. It's probably not an employer-employee best relationship. And in terms of PhDs, it even gets worse. But as a PI, I have had colleagues of mine who have gone through these stages, including me, and I can assure you, it's just a matter of time. Are you willing to give that time to your student is the question you have to ask yourself. Because when they bounce back, the literature is there. You just need time to catch up. It's just that we in our heads have made up the situation that that time is not available to the woman. So therefore, this is the rippling effect we get when the woman wants to join the workforce. It's probably too late is what we give. But I want to say it's not. It is actually the opposite. You have founded the family, hooray. And I want to congratulate you with a medal because this is what we do as a society, and we uplift each other and not really push back. So this is the second unconscious bias we all have. The third and the last point which I want to make is a conscious bias. As someone who has been a young PI, I was 31 when I joined as a faculty and assistant professor. I'm no more an early career. I'm at a position where I can now train, mentor, also postdocs and others, and also early career PIs. What I have realized is that there is an active discussion forum among few of us who decide that whether a woman or a man has to be picked up in a position. There are active discussions for it. And one can now deny that, but I've been a part of these discussions. For example, will the girl be able to pick up the boxes harder than a boy PhD? Should I take a smart PhD girl? Always yes. But further down the line, is that a requirement for a postdoc? It's not. Probably she'll not be able to travel. So there are these discussions, or there are these conscious thoughts in every employee's mind to decide which CV to pick. And I find this also reverse. I have been on a PhD panel where a girl PhD would say, I would not want to do a PhD with a female PI. So the conscious is not just male. It's also very much there in all the genders, and we think about it very consciously. So I think these 3 points, in my opinion, are the rippling factor for why we see less women in science and academia, about reading literature, about publishing, about output. We could not now talk about subset of these, but absence or less support system. The second point is the pace with which, the 1 year pace, which gets reduced for the motherhood period, which we exaggerate to a level not required. It's a small break. Please consider that as a break. And lastly, the conscious bias, where we consider about discussing the points which are required. That's it, I'll stop there.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. And I think along with that, when you say the reverse is also true, when you pick CVs based on whether somebody is able to choose the color of the curtains better, or the menu at a conference better, so those roles are typically assigned to one particular gender. So great for you to have brought that up. Bittu, you have a very different perspective of it, and you sort of come from a transgender, transmasculine background. So do explain to the audience what that means, because all of us could do with a little bit of priming up, and also going beyond that. I know the challenges have been immense, but if you can also layer it with what you do in terms of caste, what you're researching in terms of other sort of layers of our non-inclusive society, so to say.
Okay, so I suppose I should start by introducing my own trans identity. So I am a genderqueer trans man. What does that mean? Most of you, so we're actually in a very privileged position in India, because our working class, largely Hijra sisters, have created a level of trans awareness in this country and in this subcontinent really that does not exist in many other parts of the world, right? So the kinds of challenges I faced in the US, where people don't even think that trans people exist, they think that this is some kind of unreal phenomenon that's being made up in people's heads, they don't understand that there is disadvantage associated with being trans. We don't have to worry about all of those same issues here. We start from a position of our sisters having built this discourse. Of course, the flip side of that is that when people hear about the word transgender in this context, they're largely thinking of trans women, right? Because the majority, the Hijra community is a trans feminine community. Someone like me is trans masculine. It's a very similar phenomenon, but in some sense in the opposite direction. And also the discourse conflates social gender with the ways in which we understand and experience our bodies. So for me, being a genderqueer trans man dissociates these two so that you can understand each separately. When I say I'm a trans man, by that I mean that my brain has an expectation of my body as a male body. So for example, if all of you actually go through this exercise right now, just close your eyes and pick up your hand, right, or hold it in front of you, right? I'm going to ask you to do this. Just close your eyes. Do you have a mental image of where your hand is? You know where it is in space, even though you can't see it, right? You have a feeling of how high it is. If you raise it, you have a sense of how high, how low, that kind of thing. And so your brain does this because there's an expectation, you know, from your sensory receptors, right, of where your hand is, how far it reaches, how high it reaches. When you move a muscle, how much higher is it going, that kind of thing. So my brain has a similar set of expectations from my body, except it assumes that the sensory touch inputs that are coming in are those that would be expected from a male body. Okay, so you can all lower your hands. Thank you for doing that exercise with me. But it explains to you how there's a component of how we feel our bodies that relates to the trance experience. And so imagine then if you had a third arm on your body, right, which you're not receiving sensory input from. I mean, you're expecting to receive sensory input from it, but you're not receiving sensory input, so it may feel like a phantom kind of body part. You may have body parts that you know they're on your body, but it surprises you each time you realize that they are there, right? This is part of what is called dysphoria in the trance experience. And so when I say I'm a trance man, I just mean that my brain expects my body to be a typically masculine body, right? And is surprised by any deviation from that. When I say I'm genderqueer, I mean that even though my brain expects my body to be masculine, that doesn't necessarily mean that I want to socially fit in a sort of masculine category. If I'm forced to say, look, you have to choose between one or the other, then I'll say, look, it just makes my life simpler if everybody uses he pronouns, for example, for me, or you know, or just treats me the way they would treat any other guy. That makes me. So, for example, if you're already distracted because you're feeling body parts that aren't there, or you're surprised by input that you are getting, that's a constant distractor in your mind. And if on top of that, people are scrutinizing you wherever you go, saying, why do you have that third arm, right? So this is something that we share with people with disability, is that you're dealing with your disability. On top of that, you're dealing with the social gaze associated with disability. And the social gaze associated with transness is gender, right? People saying, but you know, you look like this, or your voice sounds like this, therefore why isn't everything else all adding up to my social expectation of what you should look like or sound like or everything else? So when I say I'm genderqueer, I say that I think the gender might actually be oppressive for all of us to varying degrees, depending on our privilege in the socially constructed gender hierarchies. And I would like to annihilate, really, and really think of what gender annihilation looks like when it comes to gender, of course, but also caste and class. And this includes then the fields of STEM. Why annihilation? Why not accept separate but equal? For many years, feminist movements, some kinds of reformist movements around caste and class, especially in the context of particular social movements in this subcontinent, have emphasized the idea of separate but equal, right? They've said, look, we can all be different, we'll be different from each other, but we will treat each other equally. And that discourse has had a lot of, you know, it's really gone forward in a lot of ways. I just want to interrogate that discourse without necessarily you know, proposing an alternative, a simplistic alternative right away. Oh, no worries, thank you. So, you know, so for example, people like Baba Sahib Ambedkar said, you cannot have separate but equal when it comes to caste. You have to annihilate the system. What does something like that look like for gender, for example? Well, for many years, there was this stubborn gap that persisted between the performance of women and men in science. 100 years ago, if you were to be an objective gatherer of data, you would conclude from your data that women couldn't do anything, right? You would conclude from your data that women couldn't do writing, reading, right? Nothing. And that was because we lived in a social world. So when we as neuroscientists gather data, the brain that we gather data from, or the behavior that emerges from it, is always shaped by social forces, right? And scientists tend to forget that. So 100 years ago, a completely objective researcher would say, look, women can't do anything, right? They can't do anything professional. And it is us as feminists who've changed the world such that women are actually getting the same, starting to get the same kinds of opportunities as men. That has produced the world today where you say, well, nobody really can just look at the data around them or collect data supporting that previous hypothesis. But to this day, even the most committed feminists find this really stubborn gap in STEM, right? Why is it that women are not in STEM science fields to the same degree as men? And this has also been related to a particular gap in spatial mathematical skills in IQ tests. So around 2007, when there was a churning, I was at Harvard at the time, I was getting my PhD, and the president of our university, Larry Summers, actually ended up doing us all a massive favor by saying, look, maybe we shouldn't be surprised that women can't do science. Right? Maybe they just can't. I mean, why are we just banging our heads against the wall talking about inclusion and diversity? The good news was that that churned a debate, right? And it really addressed a lot of the latent sexism and racism and so on that we were dealing with at Harvard at the time. And one of the things that emerged was a set of studies where people across genders were trained on video games, right, that simulated spatial skills. And they found that, that playing these video games improved everybody's performance, unsurprisingly. But it also narrowed the gender gap in these stubbornly persistent IQ tests, right? The persistent gap sort of narrowed. And so this then sort of puzzled everybody, because we all know that boys and girls are sitting in the same classroom today. We're saying, look, they're equal in the classroom, but they're separate categories. But the point is, as long as they are separate categories, when they go home, they are treated differently, or even in the schoolyard, they are treated differently, right? Girls think that they must not play games. They must not play video games, right? That's a trivial waste of time. Triviality is something allowed for boys, right? Games are allowed for boys, right? In a completely, we all know that there's a gap between how boys and girls play game. And so now it turns out that something like performance in IQ tests that are relevant to developing the kinds of spatial and numerical skills that, that are required in STEM may just depend on, are you actually getting, you know, practical experience of Newtonian mechanics by throwing a ball around, right? So separate but equal is a line of thought that we must all question to think of future possibilities of liberation for all of us with respect to gender, with respect to caste, with respect to class, with respect to disability, and so on. And finally, this is a perspective that I bring to the table because I am a trans person, right? Because I see gender is not working for me, and from the margins I see it is not working for everyone else. So another you know, perspective, therefore, that I think everyone needs to think about is, what is the perspective from the margins? Not just one of include me, right? Keep your hierarchies intact and just place me somewhere in them. That's not what I'm asking for. I am saying that people on the margins have a unique understanding of all the things that are messed up about the mainstream. So use those perspectives to interrogate the mainstream and change the ways in which we think equity might or might not work. So I'll stop there and go ahead.
No, thanks very much. I mean, that's great context for all of that we want to talk about. And of course, you also bring in very subtly the issue of tokenism in representation. So fantastic. I think what we also want to hear from you is how the STEM ecosystem really fits into all of these concepts and has, you know, traditionally or historically been, and how we are looking at it now in India, and whether there are things that excite you for the future, and more. So we'll come to that in a bit. Before that, we'll hear from Benno, his perspectives, because Benno has been there, done that, been in many countries around the world and seen the STEM ecosystem of each of these countries from the lens of DEI, of course, and from other lenses. And so he will be able to tell us whether we are in India in a privileged position already, or there are countries which are faring better than us.
Okay, thank you so much. So at the outset, I would like to give you a token of appreciation. So this is the Braided River. It's a book that we just published proudly at UNESCO New Delhi. The Braided River, the universe of Indian women in science. So this only addresses one gender. And anybody who would like to have a copy of that, please send me an email. It's open access, and we have it also available as PDF. So I would like to share a number of points on how to make the science arena a better place. Right at the beginning, I would like to say the obvious. I don't understand why governments are still spending every year, pre-COVID, $2 trillion combined on what they call defense spending. During COVID, it has risen, and it is rising right now. We need that money to solve the real issues that we have. We need to spend some of that money, and it includes every single country. We need to set some of that money being spent on science, education, science, and technology. So that's my first point. You asked me of places where I've been living in the world. I left Germany when I was 26 years old, and I went to the United Arab Emirates, and then to Saudi, and then back to the Emirates again, and then to Qatar. So I spent quite a number of years in the Arab states of the Gulf, and they are kind of being looked at as if they oppress the women and as if they are not doing enough for the women. I can only assure you it's not the truth. The women there have risen like a phoenix, and they should be very, very proud of how they have brought up the women. It doesn't mean that enough has been done, but they have done a lot. I also spent 5 years in Africa, in particular in Ethiopia. I was astonished at one panel that I participated, that all the panelists were men, whereas the audience was full of women, and I asked them, what are you doing? Why don't the sisters come and join the brothers here on the stage? So there's also a mental concept. They have the women, but they don't participate. They just need to click the switch. We also spent 5 years with the family in Thailand, which is, of course, an extremely liberal country in terms of gender. And yeah, Thailand is doing very, very good for women participation. I don't know all the genders. I can only talk about men and women. But for the women participation, they are actually one of the best countries in the world for primary, secondary, and tertiary education. But then there is a steep drop from 52%, actually stronger than the men, to 28%. And I think in India, you asked me, I think India is also doing very, very well on the same level, but you have the same issues here. After tertiary education, there is a huge dropout. Why does that matter? So it matters for two prime reasons, and for sure there are more reasons than that. One is, of course, fairness, but the other is economy. Approximately 50% of the people in the world are women, and do we really want to leave them out? What about the equality? What about the economy? They have a contribution to make, not only for the economy, but also to solve the real issues that they have. And I'm not talking about defense, I'm talking about defending ourselves against pandemics, biodiversity loss, pollution, environmental degradation, climate change. We need the women and all other genders as well to participate. This is the business of everybody. There are other groups than men, and men are dominating the sciences, but we should not let the other groups out. These issues to be solved concern all genders, and they concern the youth and everybody, so everybody should be involved. Talking about the SDGs a little bit, and it was said that science, I think you said that, science is the best tool that we have available to bring up solutions. So the human life support system is also reflected in the SDGs. It is actually quite surprising that we have an SDG for water, SDG 6, and we have an SDG for food, SDG 2. We can live 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, only 3 minutes without air. Why is there no SDG for air? So again, we need to mobilize everybody. Also, when we formulate the SDGs, everybody needs to participate so that we don't forget something so important like developing an SDG for air, right? I mentioned biodiversity conservation, climate change. We also need to mobilize women and everybody else into the research of clean energy. We cannot continue just burning the fossil fuel like we are doing it, because we have the energy paradox. Plastic pollution, we need to develop more recyclable and more degradable plastics. The oceans have, by now, probably more plastic than fish in them. And yeah, so at UNESCO, we most certainly encourage science for all. We should focus on real issues. One of the previous panelists used the phrase, leaving nobody behind. We have already left a lot of people behind. I give you the pro-COVID figures. 4.7 billion, that's more than half of us. We are now about 8 billion people in the world. When I was born, it was about 3 billion. More than half, 4.7, have at least 1 month per year difficult access to fresh water. More than half. 1.2, no or lack of access to electricity and energy. And 820 million a daily struggle to find food. So there we also need to mobilize the science to find solutions. As a matter of fact, we have already a lot of solutions, so also we need to apply the solutions. So the science communication needs to happen better. Scientists cannot just only talk to scientists and say, oh, I found this and I found that. No, we have to bring it over to the decision makers, and we need the right people in the decision makers. So, Ministry of Science, the minister should be somebody with a science background. Ministry of Education, the minister should be somebody with an education background. Ministers of Defense, they all have a defense background, most of them, not always. So, yeah, in agriculture, they should have an agricultural background. Most certainly in environment, so important. They should have a background in environment. Most of the time, unfortunately, they have a background in politics or law. We should not do that. So science should be a platform to achieve peace. That's, by the way, why UNESCO was established, as a platform to achieve peace on the platforms of science, education, and culture. We need to achieve the SDGs. We are far away from achieving them. UNESCO has gender equality as an overarching global priority since more than 22 years at least. But we are still talking about men and women. There are probably 14 different genders being formulated if you search that. So, having said that, for me, gender equality, because genders are not equal. They have differences. But what it means is there should be equal respect, equal access, and most certainly equal pay for the same job. The new normal that we have to achieve in the world by mobilizing science, I would call that living in harmony with nature. Right now, we are kind of behaving as if we have 2.5 planets available. We cannot continue to do that because our children and grandchildren and their grandchildren have to pay the price for it. So it requires all genders to participate, and every single one of us to achieve living in harmony with nature. Just at the end, one word on open access. So, of course, UNESCO supports open access very much, and I've been publishing since more than 20 years with Springer Nature, and it's a fantastic publishing house. I have so much respect for you, and I'm so thankful for you. I've been an editor of 6 volumes on the subcar ecosystems of the world, salt desert ecosystems. Also an editor of the Water, Energy, Food Security Nexus in the Arab region, jointly with UNESCO, United Nations University, and Springer Nature. That was not open access, it was before the open access time. And right now, and we are expecting 3 volumes to be published this year, the Water, Energy, Food Security Nexus in Asia Pacific, 3 volumes. And that is the first time that I'm publishing open access with Springer. And because of the discussion with UNESCO and Springer, it cost us an 18-month delay. And it was very, very stressful. So it's not stressful only on the authors to pay, it's also very, very stressful to find the way through the bureaucracy in intergovernmental organizations. So we have to learn from that. After we publish these 3 volumes, we have to learn from that and make it much simpler, because an editor has so much work to do, so much communication, so much checking and checking again. I cannot just go through the bureaucracy of 18 months delaying this. Good news is I'm already in the process of mobilizing the Water, Energy, Food Security Nexus for Africa, so they will be in touch with you very soon, our office in Nairobi. And finally, we are also publishing, or I'm publishing in a private capacity with Springer, a new book series called Blue Carbon Ecosystems. And I invite you all, if you would like to be the guest editor of a volume, or if you would like to contribute, please contact me and you would be very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that macro picture of things, and of course for the book. Thank you. I've been looking forward to read it. At the same time, you brought up some issues, number one of which caught my ear was Germany, and where you worked earlier, or where you were born and moved out. That's where our headquarters also are. And I see a connect with Lipi here, who's been in Germany for her PhD. And there are things that we can talk about transnationally, how things have shaped for India and how things have shaped for other countries in DEI issues. But before that, I want to go over to Mallika, who's basically lone soldier, torchbearer of DEI in her particular profession. So tell us your perspectives, and of course, do tell us where you see these issues being addressed in surgery, and where do you have optimism for the future?
Well, thank you. And speaking last after such learned and erudite speakers, it is itself a challenge. But let's start. So, carrying forward from what my co-panelists just said, where India ranks as far as this global gender gap is concerned. As far as the latest data, India ranks only at 135th amongst 146 nations. And I was really surprised to read, although I was asked not to quote any data, but this was so startling that India is at 135th position. And we are far behind all our neighbors, excepting Afghanistan, Iran, and things like that. And Pakistan, sorry. Yeah, how I missed that. So, if we look into the aspect of women in surgery that I would like to touch upon, there are a number of women who are joining surgery as a, the current generation. But when I was there and joined surgery, there were not many. And I think I was the only girl amongst 25 boys. So if you ask my opinion on this, at that time also, because I was brought up in a family in a very gender neutral environment. My grandfather and everybody was, they just treated children like children. It was not like boys and girls. And my mother hailed from a very remote background in a village in Kanpur. And from there she came to Delhi, and she was mentored by another lady, is a very famous cardiologist. Many of you must be knowing her, Dr. S. Padmavati, who founded the National Heart Institute. And she was the first lady cardiologist of India. And my mother was exactly her mentee, and she became the first interventional cardiologist in the state of UP. And also she was the second batch of residents doing DM in cardiology at AIIMS, New Delhi. So with this background, and then she won a number of fellowships, and she was all, globe-trotting, and in 1950s without mobile or internet, being from such a remote Brahmin family, in those days it was not, nobody would think of such things. And so being brought up in a family like this, and my father was always very supportive, very encouraging, so it wasn't much difficult for me to have a very positive mindset. But if I look into my med school itself, and it's the same story everywhere, that the number of women that join, the girls I should say, in the medical school, they are at par with the number of boys in the class. And this number starts getting skewed when it comes to surgical residents. And if you look at the number of attendings, you can only count on fingers, right? So the other thing is, when you look into such branches like surgical oncology, surgical gastroenterology, neurosurgery, cardiothoracic surgery, orthopedics, you can, urology, you don't have girls there. Still you don't have girls and much representation from women. Why? Because these are super specialty branches. There is a very long road that people have to travel. 5 years of MBBS, then 3 years residency and post-graduation, then again 3 years of super specialization. So it's a long road, and then you don't get into these residency programs one after the other. There are intense competitions, and even after you complete your super specialization degree, you have to do some fellowships, travel abroad. So it's a long and arduous journey for sure. So that's why I feel that many women voluntarily back out. They don't find mentors. They don't have spousal support at home. And of those who do join, there are people who will always look down upon them. They doubt their credibility. They are not given due importance in the team. So if there are say 25 boys doing the rounds, the surgeon, the chief surgeon might give more importance to what a boy is answering rather what a girl is answering. That does happen. It's changing very fast. And as of now, I can tell you in my own department, we have 2 fellows who are HPV fellows, and both are girls. So things are changing, and as you asked me whether it is looking bright or not, certainly yes. So these, like I'm telling you, these very subtle things, no, these are called microaggressions. If you are sitting in a meeting, if you ask a question and you are not given that much of importance and you are just brushed aside like that, so it loses your confidence. So that is what people need to understand, that women are not to be taken lightly. If you have real brains, then you will stand out, and that's the resilience you have to put through and go through the same. Thank you.
Thanks, Mallika. That's surely the otherness, the others in the room is what I included, might have faced some point of time in our careers. We'll move on to a more nuanced discussion now, having laid out what exactly this means for each of you. To a state or to a question of why do you think being inclusive, being diverse in our teams makes sense? Because lots of people here and outside of this room who are watching us live might also start to think, well, all of this is okay, we're doing fine in our organizations, we are making profits, we are achieving targets, etc. Why do you think we should bring in the aspect of diversity and inclusion despite all of it looking fine?
Yeah, so why include more is the question, or yeah, does it make sense? So I have heard quite derogatory comments also as answers to these questions, and it always surprised me that it's not about that we add color to the table. Now, to add, for example, I'll quote myself as an employer when I'm writing grants. I also now have my team, let me put the question back to myself. Why should I have more minority folks? Firstly, it comes down to the point that are you open towards these questions in general? You make yourself vulnerable. Firstly, we all are here vulnerable, and I have to firstly also commend Bittu's ability and their ability to come here, because it takes efforts to be vulnerable, to open yourself, and this is a distraction for us, for our work. So our work is the centerpiece. I want to say this, that the more I speak away from it is a point which I want to bring back. So when we work in science, I would like to include diversity to my team because it brings immense competitiveness. It just brings immense merit to the group. I have 3 minority students and especially first generation folks, the heat which they bring if they have not been in the academia, and no one, not the father, not the mother, and this I want to just not comment on women, for instance, because one has to recognize we are in India. The definition of diversity is different here. There are folks, male members, and from the people who have not been exposed to higher income groups, have never been exposed to what academia can give. This opportunity that if they perform the PhDs and all the doors are open, Harvard including, all the universities is open, imagine the consequences you're bringing to their families. So I feel immensely proud, immensely participative in their journeys, because some of them have been from small villages, have not attained, how to say, the maturity to understand that there exist infinite amount of possibilities in academia. They have probably been here because of someone holding their hand somewhere. So I feel almost passionate to be a part of their journey. I think that is the second thing other than competence, which is partially selfish. We want to have more number of people coming in who can devote their time, their efforts, their mind to our group, so that's partly selfish. But the other is their journeys. When you see and you hear their messages that this is what I have been now getting, and these are the scholarships I'm getting in the US. Now I'm coming back. What do I do? So you have literally transcend their lives into something more bigger. So why wouldn't you be part of it rather than something which has already been there, right? So for me, there are these two components.
Yeah, so I agree with everything Lipi has said. In addition, when a lot of people ask this question, right? Why be inclusive and so on? My answer typically is that one shouldn't have to give you a reason for this, right? I can give you reasons, I will give you some, right? But I ask people, look, there's no evidence based on which you're going to come to a decision about what kind of world you want to live in, right? Eventually, people make that decision based on the ways in which they've been conditioned in the past, and whether they see a future without the kinds of constraints that have held people down, right, as liberating or not. And all of us have fought constraints. Most of us have fought constraints with some degree of privilege, which is why we're in this room, right? So if you look at my own experience, for example, people often say, what are all of the problems you faced as a trans person? And I say, well, the usual ones are there. I get misgendered every time I go to a conference. The people don't know where to place me because most housing is gendered. And, of course, I face all of those problems on a daily basis. But they pale in comparison to what most other trans folks face, right? And why are they facing a different situation from me? So often people say, oh, it is some great personal achievement of yours. It isn't, right? I come from a very privileged background. My parents were both academics. That by itself makes being in academia relatively easy for me. And I have caste privilege, I have class privilege. In many ways, the fact that I'm here tells you how much stronger the structure of caste is in academia than even the structures of transphobia, which everybody, Indian academia has a particular problem with acknowledging caste in a way that it does not around other discourses. The discourse around gender is an international discourse. We pretend that we would all like to be part of a gender equal world because we would like to look good for the rest of the world. But caste is our own little dirty secret, right? And if we can keep it hidden and not really examine the ways in which caste influences who's in this panel, who's in this room, and so on, then, nobody has to we don't have to deal with the ways in which we are complicit in caste, and we don't have to air our dirty laundry in public. That's really how caste is dealt with in academia in India. And now the reasons. Why be inclusive? Well, I think, it's important to just ask people whether they would like to be inclusive or not. It's something that people rarely get asked, right? People are often either judged for not being inclusive enough or told to be inclusive, but it's very rare to really get consent from somebody by saying, would you like to be in that kind of world or not? To really ask people to ask themselves and produce an affirmative answer. That for me has been really, really an invaluable tool in negotiating transphobia, right? Often people treat me in ways I don't want to be treated. And instead of saying, you're treating me badly, or saying, you should do better, I ask people, look, this is how this makes me feel. I think you are the kind of person who can do better than this. Don't you agree? And almost everybody says yes. Everybody wants to be a good person. Everybody would like their behavior to not cause harm to somebody else. And I think that's something we should really harness in taking this discourse forward. So what is the experience of, for example, being part of the Rohit Vemula movement when I was in the University of Hyderabad, where Rohit was a young Dalit student who faced systemic exclusion in the sciences and was not alone in that, right? We knew several such people. And eventually he committed suicide after a prolonged series of clashes, really, with the Sanskritization and really sort of an anti-scientific temper that was taking over several Central University campuses today. In that context, right, that process of engaging with exclusion in the science made me realize that science in India suffers from Brahmanism, not in terms of just who's doing science, but in terms of how science is done. So this then just sort of really blasted open my understanding of how to teach science. What is a good science student? A good science student in India is somebody who sits and ratta-maros everything that they're told to ratta-maro, right? And that ratta-maroing tradition is core Brahmanism, right? What is it to be a good student has been defined in fundamentally Brahminical ways in this country. It means that anybody who does science will tell you that if you catch a science student when they're in high school, they're going to be such better scientists than if you catch them in college, than if you catch them at PhD. Why? Because the longer they spend in our educational system trying to conform, the more dismal their critical thinking abilities are. And science is entirely about critical thinking, right? And it's not just science that is about critical thinking. In business, right? Not that I'm necessarily a fan of business, but in everything, what is it that shakes up the existing system and brings new ideas? It's basically new people. It's people with new perspectives. And if it's going to continue to be the same kinds of people who are doing science or doing really anything else, we're not going to be getting those new perspectives. And those new perspectives can really shake up the ways in which we think science should be done. So now we're understanding that one needs to teach critical thinking. Now we're understanding that, and many people have been doing it in their classrooms for a very long time, but the understanding that this must be something we inculcate as the norm rather than the exception. These are things we're realizing we have to do if we want our science ecosystem to not produce research which is derivative, to produce research ideas which are original, right? And as a teacher in general, I will say that I worry about our education system when the longer students spend in it, the less interested they are, the less dynamic they are, the less energy they have, the less ideas they have. It's all been stomped out, right? So I am hopeful that that will change. And finally, I will also say this, that the field of neuroscience and behavior overall really needs to be changing dynamically in terms of listening to people with disabilities. Why? Again, the discourse around disability has been, we are all able-bodied and we should include people with disabilities in tokenistic ways. But people with disabilities have extremely unique perspectives on the entire system of how we function, how the mainstream functions, that I think are really, really core to understand all of the ways in which we socially are holding each other down, ways in which often you're in a room and you know that the composition of who is in the room is going to be stifling everybody from thinking, from feeling, from expressing what they have to say. And so how is it that we as human beings cannot be in each other's way? That's something that we're going to have to think about. And I think that a lot of the perspectives that have been emerging from the writings of young people with disabilities are really crucial to that. So I'll stop there with this in answer to this question.
No, thank you. I think what you bring forth is, I'm happy for your students, because you know, you shoot off these hydra heads and then ask them to think about these things, right? So that's fantastic. I mean, I have 1001 directions I can lead this conversation now, but I think I'll come back, rein myself in, and maybe we'll have a chat later, and come to Benno for his perspectives on what he thinks is the benefit of being inclusive.
Thank you very much. Just 2 points on that. It's basically inclusive and diversity for me kind of means the same thing. And so I have 2 points. So one is it's very important for fairness purposes to be fair to everybody. That's maybe the most important point, because people shouldn't be excluded. The second is economy. I tried to explain that already earlier. I'm convinced that everybody's economy will be benefit from inclusion and from diversity. And you mentioned that a team that is diverse will be more productive. In UNESCO, we also believe that. We believe that teams which are diverse, and not only gender diverse, by the way, also age diverse and professional background diverse, they will be more productive. So the economic outcome will be much better. And I want to give you one example. Many years ago, a major car company invited UNESCO to be part of their environment prize. And we agreed. And so they had a jury of 9 people, and they represented 9 countries in the Middle East. And when I went there, they were all old men, all over 60, and each one of them only voted for the entries that came from his particular country. So that's what happens in a worst case scenario if you don't have inclusivity and diversity. So UNESCO, we have a lot of experience with that. We assisted them. We said, no, we don't want to be part of the jury, but we want to be an observer of the jury, and we put together a gender and aged and professional background-based jury, and then that environment prize started rocking. It was really generating fantastic results, whereas before that it was, to say it mildly, it was quite a bit boring. So diversity is of great importance, not only for science, really for most walks of life. Thank you.
So I can speak about my profession as a medical faculty, and I feel we have patients coming from all sorts of backgrounds, you know, all sorts of religion, and it's a whole bouquet of people that we are exposed to. And how can you ever think of leaving half of the population, that is females, and the others away from the mainstream? It's just not possible. It's not ethical. It definitely adds to their perception, the patient's, you know, the interaction. It's very humane. It's not, even if we talk about robotics and artificial intelligence in surgery, especially in the HPB surgery, it's coming in a big way. But still, it is a human being who's being operated upon, and it's the human being who is operating the robot. So human interaction is very important in day-to-day patient interaction and their care. And I definitely feel women do add a lot to the compassion that they show to the patients and the way they relate to us. And I must say that we do lack in having these discussions, and I'm very happy that Springer has brought this up, because I was in a panel with the American College of Surgeons, and I have had the opportunity, you know, to visit various world-renowned centers through all the fellowships, and personally I never felt a discrimination. I also have a Heidelberg Connect. I went to their liver transplant unit there and worked with Professor Buechler. So I never ever felt anywhere that I am a lady, and a petite lady who looks also a little bit young than what I am. So nobody ever discriminated me. I was treated very normally. And that is how I would like everybody to have the experience being in surgery, never to be, you know, left out, or even why should you have such a thought in mind? Most of my residents, they are all, you know, they come from all walks of life. Some are from very established families, from other reservations, you know, all sorts of people are there, and we have a very healthy environment, and we just treat them as residents and teach them, and it's very harmonious. We never had any issues there. So I think inclusiveness is a must for a society to grow. Men, women, others, they are all the branches of the same tree. Thank you. I was just.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's a position of privilege, of course, to have people who support you and to have an environment that is supportive of what you're doing. We'll have a very quick round now and open up for questions. The round that I want to have is, if you became the Prime Minister of this country for a day, or let me choose something else, the principal scientific advisor of this country for a day, and you were given 3 solutions that you could implement or propose, what would those 3 be from the lens of what we're discussing today?
It's sort of that Miss India question, right? You have to instantly reply. But if I would be in a position of power, I would understand that I can make changes in the system. And the first change that I would like to do is to probably understand that investing more money will not give more solutions. So can I in some way improve visibility of the people who have been marginalized? And that doesn't come with money. So you would have to include people in discussions right at the top. And I'm thankful that you're doing these panel discussions, and probably, there are changes at the publishing house and, all these kind of changes. So first thing is that introduce these discussions at the top level from the folks who are in that community. Because some of you who have been now here understand, where all of us are coming from, and therefore I think this minute amount of enlightenment is possibly going to change the way you will think in the future, and imagine the way now these discussions will happen at the top level. So I think there is where there is already a pushback in terms of large conference tables. So can I bring that openness is the first thing, especially in the reviewing committees. In the reviewing committees in science, and I think the person just left who I'm addressing to in terms of national academies as well, the ratios are less. So can we just bring folks from the top down? The second thing which I would like to bring is the, if you can assign the investment in particular at the PhD stage, which is completely devoid of curiosity at the present education system, can we do something there? The PhDs are the gold mine here. Unfortunately, they are not treated as such. So the PhD system right now is considered with more fellowship. There is this PM Relief Fund, which grants 80,000 per month to some of the folks, but again, it has introduced a lot of negative changes as well in terms of comparison with even some of the faculties at the private institutions not given that much. So I think money doesn't change anything. It's probably a vibrant mind which is required at the table to introduce more changes. So second is that can we do mandatory therapy sessions for PhDs to make the awareness that what are the possibilities they can have, and can we minimize the damage to the system. And lastly, I think if I would be a principal scientific advisor, I would really change the way we procure items in our research. So even if we have the funding, the current scientific system does not allow us to work in a way that a US system would do, which is instantaneous buying. We have the tendering system, and it takes ages, at least a month or so, to get something what I want. And I think this is something regardless of the gender, but why not? Like, if I have the opportunity, I would just change these things. Over to you.
Yeah, I've been asked to politely remind everybody that lunch is waiting. So please don't leave without having lunch. We're winding up this panel discussion soon.
Okay, yeah, so this is actually what I had initially told Subhra I wanted to begin with, but I decided to end with it because of how this is structured, which is what do we need to do? As a trans person, there are 3 things. Just bear with me a couple minutes. I know all of you heard the magic word lunch and are migrating, but you will hear something here that you will not hear elsewhere, because it's not often that a trans person in science will speak to you. You need, people in institutions especially, which run science programs, need to understand that when trans people apply, they will apply with a variety of, with at least 2 names and genders on their CV. These need to be not automatically rejected. So there are some very simple sort of correction measures that need to be incorporated to make institutions and processes of application trans-friendly. When trans people are in institutions, there need to be gender-neutral accommodations, including bathrooms, single-stall bathrooms for them, of the kind that you see in Indian trains, right? That's actually the perfect place. It's one place where trans people can go to the bathroom without fear. So since people are resistant to change, that's an example of a working system for trans people. And the discourse on gender in science needs to be a discourse on gender in science, not just women in science, right? So for example, I also have a 1.5-year-old kid, and I agonized a lot about, for example, maternity policies that are defined as maternity policies, right? They may not quite fit me, but I think talking about people who are having babies, who are primary caregivers, and also ideally structuring it so that men get parental leave so that they feel like they should be doing some parenting during that time, right? And that for a man to bounce back the day after they have a baby to work is as problematic, right, as a woman being essentially caged to not do so. It's the other side of that coin. I think those, thinking of what these policies would look like, that's another set of things that we need to do. So overall, I think every institution should just implement the equal opportunity cell that they are actually mandated to and take inclusion and diversity seriously. So that's one thing that I would do for inclusion and diversity if I were the principal scientific advisor. The second is something actually that I think is going to happen, which is, and it's relevant to the fact that we're having this discussion with the publishing house, which is the idea for there to be a deal whereby the Indian government purchases a subscription such that every citizen, right, can have access to science. This is becoming, I think, really, really important. For science to not just be in the hands of scientists and medical practitioners, but really everybody. I can't tell you the number of trans people who had to DIY their own understanding of who they are, right? I've understood myself, relative, and several other trans kids who have they're not in the STEM ecosystem at all, but they are able to figure out who they are relative to the literature only when the literature is accessible to them. So that's another thing. And thirdly, I would say, I think restructuring has to go hand in hand with budgets. So I would largely agree with what you said about how more defense type budgeting needs to move towards education and research. But I do think that these need to be democratized. So I think we need to involve many more sections of the population in terms of getting a sense of what they would like our science to look like, and in terms of participating in science. So one of our projects in our lab, which is understanding numerical cognition in dogs, we chose dogs because it's a citizen science project. Anyone who has a dog anywhere, regardless of whether they've even completed school, can participate in our experiments and understand what it means to do randomized trials, understand what it means to worry about the observer effect of the scientist, right? These are things they can learn, they can participate in producing science without necessarily having a school degree. So we need to, I think, democratize science. Science is not something that has to just be done by people with PhDs. I think that is a really, really important change. We're really only going to be able to change things all over the world, but especially in this country, when scientific thinking becomes something that everybody does, and when everybody feels like they can do science and they can shape science. So those are, I think, the 3 things I do.
Okay, yeah, difficult question to ask a United Nations official, but then we are providing authoritative advice in any case. So, so being from the UN, of course, first, I would say I would do everything I can. I would advise the government to do everything that it can to establish long-lasting peace with all of the neighboring countries and all of the other countries in the world, in particular since India is expected to become the largest populated country in the world next year. Second, I would reshuffle the budget a little bit so that all the poverty issues in India will be solved. That shouldn't be so difficult with the budget that is available. And number three, I would do a lot for the environment. I would bring up the number of UNESCO biosphere reserves from 12 to 50 in the next 50 years, one each year. Spain has more than 50. Spain is a comparatively small country when you compare that with the huge size of India. And I would turn New Delhi into the cleanest city of the world. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll just quickly say a few points. I'm a great believer in our Prime Minister, Shri Modi. And why so, I'll tell you the points. Because as a cancer surgeon, we come across patients from all parts of UP, and I had a stint in Mumbai also, where I was working for nearly 1.5 years in a corporate sector. So the difference is that most of the cancer patients are in our region, they are from a poor socioeconomic background, and as you can well imagine, the costs associated with cancer treatment is humongous. And with the wide implementation of Prime Minister's Ayushman Bharat Yojana, which gives a guarantee of about 5 lakh rupees, we are able to complete the treatment of patients without a penny being spent by the patient himself or herself. And that's a big shot in the arm. And then we have various other cancer relief grants which are being actively pursued in Modi's government, and it's the Prime Minister's Relief Fund, and also our Yogi government, the Chief Minister Relief Fund. So we have actually, the moment we write application, within 2 months the grants come, and by the time we prep the patient for chemotherapy, radiotherapy, surgery, he already has some resource in hand. Otherwise, cancer treatment in India without any insurance policy is borne largely by the patient. And if you are not insured, you can imagine all this money comes from borrowing from local village heads at exorbitant interests. And the other thing I like about Modi ji is, even recently from the Red Fort, he shouted the top of his voice regarding gender neutrality. And he is very committed. He made toilets, sanitization and toilet facilities even in the remotest of villages. Nobody ever thought of it so far. And what else I've written so that I don't miss? Yes, and then he is also giving grants to women to build houses. The money comes to the woman. Even my maid's, she has a big family, the father doesn't care, but she now got 2 lakh rupees, so she reconstructed her house. So that's how Modi is working at the remotest of villages. There are district cancer control programs, wellness centers being developed. And just last word, give me 30 seconds before I stop. So our associations, surgeons, surgical associations, medical associations also have a role to play in this, increasing diversity and representation of women and others. Because many of us also take out journals, Indian Journal of Surgery, Indian Journal of Surgical Oncology, and then we have SSO, which has the Annals of Surgical Oncology, that is also published by Springer. So you must have a very diverse editorial board with more women into it in the editorial team as chief editors, more peer reviewers, more women should be asked to comment on various articles. That's how you build up confidence, and that's how you build up a great team. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Irrespective of political affiliations, we all agree that democratization, not just of science, but also the research ecosystem that we all operate in, is something that would immensely benefit from the diversity that we're talking about. There are lots of hands up. I don't know how many questions I can take because, okay, we do have time, Abhi. So Nidhi's hand went up first.
I think I also have the privilege of having the mic in my hand. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, firstly, for the absolutely wonderful insights that you all have shared. as someone who's very keen on DEI, and I'm also leading the DEI strategy for Springer Nature in Pune, so I can tell you that there were so many points that I myself was like, okay, these are areas that we worked on, these are areas we've probably thought of and done nothing about. But the one thing that I want to start with Lipi first, you spoke of conscious and unconscious bias. And in a country like ours, I think the third bias that one really needs to overcome is confirmation bias. Because that's one that we are perhaps just, born and brought up with. I mean, we believe in certain things because it was said to us and we never want to think outside of the box. That needs to change for us to make any progress in where we are headed towards, right? But yes, the unconscious bias plus the confirmation bias are the two massive hindrances that we have. Bittu, I'm in awe of you. I just need to say this because there are so many points you touched upon, and I want to know more about what you think of homophobia and versus transphobia as such. I don't think we have the time enough for that discussion. I'll catch up with you separately on that one. But I do want to ask you a question on, and I think that was also Benno who brought it up. This is about the Indian education system, the population, the fairness that you mentioned as such. Now, this is not just a shift that we can make scientifically. This is not just a shift that we can bring in because we are talking about it and we're privileged to talk about it. This is a mindset shift which perhaps would take months, years, decades, I don't know. And in a country as diverse as India, and in a country where we are from the very childhood taught, unity in diversity, honestly, no one really understood, or even a lot of folks don't understand today, what unity or inclusion in this case means in a diverse population. So where do you see the changes really have to come from? And I did hear you say from the top, I heard someone say that it needs to come from the top, but I think it also needs to start from the very beginning. So what are your thoughts there?
I'll just add that...
Yeah, we don't have a lot of time, right? Should we take more questions?
I mean, people can have lunch and people can listen to us. It's their choice. But I just want to add that this panel didn't happen out of accident. So the people on this panel that you see were chosen very carefully, just so that we have all these perspectives. And of course, the question that you ask about confirmation bias and about where change should start, these are the change makers. Most of them of the future, and somebody who's already making change at the top.
And since you mentioned future, I must say this, that the future is a big population to cater to, but it also starts today, and the population that's sitting today and the ones elder to us are way too rigid in their thoughts and ideas.
Okay, so just very quickly, something like racism, right? And specifically in the context of the US, which is where I live, anti-black racism in the US was for a long time this thing that we were addressing. We were saying it'll take time for people to shift their minds, blah, 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 blah. And then you have Black Lives Matter, a non-academic, non-science movement. And now in 1 year, suddenly I'm seeing international societies that I'm part of saying we should address racism, and specifically anti-black racism in our societies. I'm seeing publishing houses put out, these statements about equal opportunity. I'm seeing job adverts that have changed. So this is just to say that some kinds of mindset changes, it's every conversation hammers away at it a little bit, but sometimes people's minds change very, very quickly when a social movement pushes them to think. And these social movements are often not originating in the sciences. So I think there's a lot to be said for how the things that we're saying should change in STEM will really only change when social movements, which are largely going to be outside STEM, push those issues forward. So that's just to hopefully bring some hope that you're waiting. I mean, even if you look at the Nirbhaya case and the ways in which there was a leap, the entire time that we were in school and college, we were just, harassment in buses was so routine, right? You were just taking a bus to go to college. I can't tell you the number of times, every week we would compare rates of harassment. We wouldn't compare events or incidents of harassment, right? Everybody who grew up in Delhi knew this. And for years, I would think, when is this going to change? And I thought, things will move gradually. And at the time that what happened with Nirbhaya took place, it was the coming together of three very specific movements, right? It was the fact that what happened was right outside JNU, and the JNU students actually holding down a 24-hour vigil in that place that actually started the momentum of that movement. And it then just changed the ways in which we were able to push legislation around harassment and assault. For years, it just moved a mountain in months. So sometimes you're just waiting and waiting for things to change more quickly. And you can't predict when the fault line will shift, but it will sometimes shift in ways that are cataclysmic and quick, and not just in this gradual way. So that's the only contribution there. Homophobia and transphobia, I will just say this, that homophobia emerges when one is, often the first inklings that people get about whether someone might be queer or not, if they're not out, relate in fact to gender, relate to ways in which people who are queer are excluded from, say, discussing their partners or discussing their families when these routine discussions take place during lunch or during casual interactions. But we're very much a context in which sexuality is not to be discussed, right? And if somebody comes to I've seen intercaste couples in STEM type workplaces face very similar barriers to being able to discuss the fact that they're in relationships with each other, interreligious couples facing these kinds of barriers. So really, we have a wider problem to address with the ways in which discussion of sexuality is suppressed. At the same time, we happen to be in an ecosystem in this subcontinent where gender is, the discourse on gender, especially non-binary genders, is just much more advanced than in many other places. So we occupy a particularly interesting point when it comes to gender and sexuality in the Indian context. And finally, that conformism bias that you were talking about, that we all deal with growing up in India, that's Brahmanism. In terms of its social origins, that's exactly what that is. Yeah.
Absolutely, thank you. Benno, I'd like your thoughts also on this point, though.
Sorry, which point did you mean? You mentioned several points.
I'll probably let Benno and you speak over lunch.
Okay.
And maybe we can get Venkatesh's question, then Swati.
I would also like
and
to ask something.
You, ma'am. First here.
Yeah.
Okay, she will. Okay.
So, I'm sorry if I am really changing the discourse or the narrative, and somewhere related to her question. My question is like from the another territory. But my question is, and Bittu, as she said, that science education.
It's a he.
He. Look at the bias.
Yeah.
Okay. I am educated in a very Brahmanical education system, and I'm professor. Pardon me for that slip. Coming back to that, quickly, I really felt the way India does science and possibly globe, it's very blind side, you get blindsided. And that objective truth of science which is created robs us of subjective differences we carry. And I'm sorry, but with due respect, when we hear the panel, we see the differences here very much. For example, my doctor friend, and I come from your same city, your world is so different from the world where very different people are existing. And that, validates. I have been thinking it as a science student, biology, and now completely into HR. So my question to this is, then why are we wanting to focus on science on everything? It's a very tantalizing question, but I'm leaving it on table.
No, that's perfectly put, I think. And specifically so because this is the basic reason we are having this panel. The reason is we are different. Let's face it and let's respect it. That's the thing that we want to put on the table. So, yeah, your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. That's why when asked the question about should we be inclusive or diverse, I don't think one should look to evidence for the answer to that question. The answer is that what you would like, part of the world you'd like to create or not? And as I said, a lot of the data that we collect, when it comes to the subjects being people, those data are going to change as our social movements change what it means for us to be people. So yes, all of that subjectivity is also objective fact. The notion that objectivity should ignore subjectivity comes from a particular dualism that is involved actually in a very Christian-informed scientific philosophy that, assumes that in some way objective, when you're objective, there is some hard truth out there that is unrelated to the subjectivity, for example, of the researcher. And in fact, one of the reasons that cases we make for inclusion and diversity is you change the researcher, the way they will see and collect even the same data on the same question will change. And so subjectivity is really, really important to acknowledge. If one wants to even pretend to get somewhere which is objective, which is at least consensus, right? Which relates to the ways in which, our findings are not specific to who we are.
I carry it on lunch, but empirical treatment has been essential, and which just kills the subjectivity of data. I'm a researcher and I supervise PhD. So
absolutely, yes. I think we will have to carry it over to lunch. It's a really huge discussion. There are people here. Venkatesh, you want to go next? And Swati, and then Akanksha. And Benno has to leave early, so...
It's okay. I think more than a question, as a submission, I think, there's a lot has been done on diversity, equity and inclusion over the years. I would not say that, and it will take some time because it's not within the room we are discussing. It has to be, a country like India has 6.5 lakh villages. One has to look at that spectrum also. But one of the important things I feel is education is certainly a leveler. We don't know how many people of different caste, religions, races are sitting in this room, and nobody is even interested in asking them, right? I think education is the core leveler which can actually level all these things. And if we can focus on, especially India at an elementary level, the enrollments are good. They're not bad, at par with the other countries. But after class 7th and 8th, a lot of girl students drop out. If we can focus on those areas, a lot of things can be changed. When I was with NSDC heading the digital skilling mission, one of the things we introduced is as a part of the new education policy is skilling in the education system, so that girl children can actually get into areas like beauty and wellness in villages. And that's a new segment which is growing, and that gives them confidence. I think if we can look at areas where there's a leak in the education process in terms of fallout of the numbers, I think that's an important area. And once education is a leveler and it brings in awareness, DEI score across any ecosystem will increase. That's my submission.
Yeah, absolutely. I think not just education, I think we should have a new education, which is what we are all sort of aiming at and looking at. So yeah, well made point.
And free education, because if it's not free, it's definitionally not a leveler.
Swati, go ahead.
Can create inequality rather than reduce it.
Thanks for that, Bittu. Once again, I echo what Nidhi said. I love you. Let's talk over lunch because there's a lot I want to discuss there. Just a quick comment on subjectivity and objectivity. So if we go all the way back to Plato, even he talked about the idea and the form. So subjectivity and objectivity cannot be separated from each other in science, and that's something that we need to learn to accept. But my question, or rather a comment for everyone, especially for Benoit, because sitting in a powerful position in UNESCO, is we talk a lot about unconscious bias and that we should do stuff at the grassroots level. Even Venkatesh just talked about skilling people in the school level. But what do we do about it? Is there ever any training about unconscious bias at the school level, even at the higher education level? There is no unconscious bias training or even unconscious bias testing, even in the IITs right now. So this is something that we are talking about, but I think it would really make sense, and I wish the room still had all of those people. There were lots of people here who could actually take this back to their institutions. We need that at the higher education level, at the middle school level, talking about unconscious bias openly and having training people to overcome unconscious bias. That's just a suggestion.
Agree. Akanksha.
I have a very simple question. When we try to absorb the principles of DEI and in the kind of work that we do every day as publisher, in the various roles that we have, it becomes very easy to fall prey to tokenism. I actually want to touch the subject of tokenism. In the efforts to be inclusive, if somebody asks you a question in some event that you're organizing or in our editorial boards, in the panels, are you inclusive? The effort that you make to be inclusive it's very easy to jump the line and fall prey of tokenism. So as a young professional who's highly enthusiastic about DEI, I want to know some tips from you how to separate these two things.
Absolutely. I just want to add that that's the everyday story of most of the people who want to be standing up and be counted, to be visible. We don't know where to draw the line. We want to do everything and we want to be everywhere because it makes sense for our careers, right? But at some point of time, you have to draw the line and you have to stand up and say, I will not be a token on this panel. I will not. Let's have a male compere next time. What say anything? Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to question these traditional roles. Why can't we just, stand up and say that these are the things I would love to do, and these are the things I'm doing because you expect me to do it, and yet, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Those roles are defined, and those are for us as young professionals to challenge, right? Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just think I want to add one more perspective to it, and it's important because I've seen the other side to it. There was a discussion prior to this that the private companies needs to be held accountable. Now, how do we do that? We introduce schemes, and now this relates to your question and your statement that it will take time. So now, this time process where we are introducing equality, where we are introducing diversity, there will be sincere attempt to include women. And that may be considered as tokenism, so therefore there has to be, I do not know how, but an intuition, inbuilt intuition, where you understand that, oh, there's a quick call for a conference and I need your talk. You say no. But there are efforts, I know from my colleagues, who are trying to be inclusive and are trying to introduce more perspectives, and they are forced by nature, but not like they do not have sincerity issues. So that is where they will take time. So I would, not say that there is a binary answer to that, because you will know that you will be called for being a woman. And I have said no to many of these because I feel that it's just for my photo on that brochure. But if you can discern the sincere attempts, then I think you are required to be there to speak, because there are very less people who make themselves vulnerable at these positions. So I think that's important as well.
Yeah, I have a very simple sort of one-line answer to your question, which is that I think tokenism is better than zero representation, but tokenism cannot be where one rests, right? So there are two of us who are professors in the Indian STEM ecosystem who are trans persons. So we're going to be tokenized, right? I mean, there aren't that many other people, right? But we also are mentoring a whole horde, actually, of young trans academics. And so my response when I'm asked to be on a panel is that often I refuse to be on panels which are either panels or which are where all the speakers are upper caste, right? But I will agree to be at such panels when I say, well, there's going to be a next one, and at that next panel, I am going to send you somebody who is trans from a marginalized position with respect to caste, somebody who's intersectional, and the composition of your panel has to change by virtue of the token voice opening it up. So, when people say that they, sort of like to keep things homogenous and privileged, saying that they don't want to be tokenistic, I refuse to accept tokenism as an excuse for not sort of starting the process of inclusion, but it can't end there. In fact, the transition has to be very rapid.
We just have a final comment from Benno. and we'll close.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry, I have to go to attend another panel, totally different one. You asked a good question. You asked about what the United Nations is really doing in daily life. I guess that's what you mean. So UNESCO has the global overarching priority gender equality in its DNA since 25 years. That means people like myself, we are obliged to consider the gender level on every aspect of our work, and it has achieved such good results that by now all United Nations agencies, there are about 55 to 60 UN agencies, believe it or not, all of them have embraced gender equality in their DNA by now. In the last 10 years, UNESCO has confirmed itself from a 25 to 75 gender imbalance on recruitment on all levels to a 50-50 level on all levels, and we have for the second time a woman as a Director General. So in addition, what we do on the education platform in particular, because we have to address very, very young people to get their behavior right from the beginning. So we do provide training against bullying in schools, and we also do provide comprehensive sexuality education in schools. Of course, it depends on the open-mindedness of the member state how far we can go with the comprehensive sexuality education. Countries which are very open-minded, like this country, for example, we can be really comprehensive, but other cultures might be a little bit more reserved, so there we have to be less comprehensive. But we have done a lot in our own courtyard to clean up the imbalance, and we have achieved really, really good results.
Thank you everybody for staying back and listening to this conversation. I cannot say how inspired I feel right now. I mean, it's always after a panel with all of you guys. I think what we are taking back today is the willingness to start discussing these issues at our own individual level, and the willingness to be open about what counts in terms of inclusivity in our own, say, small divisions, small departments, etc. I think I'll just say thank you, all of you, and if you liked this panel, show them some love. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Lunch and
no, before we move down from here, there's a small token of appreciation from Springer Nature. Subhra Alpna will help you out with those.
Thank you, Boer. तो मैंने काट ही दिया.
Thank you very much, everyone, and I would like to request all of you once again to please make sure to visit that booth there in the left corner of the room. Our colleagues are waiting to showcase a small tool that might be very helpful for you.